Thank you very much. Obviously, it's an honor to be here at the Clinton School. I do want to thank Khalid. Is remarkable, I think, and he was the first connection, and I don't think it's a secret. I'll say it publicly here as well, that Khalid is somebody that I admire enormously. Partly that linguistic ability, partly the places where he's been, but also his sense of humor, his deep interest in Afghanistan, and you know, the use, if you will, of that history, those proverbs. I think we share an interest in that as well. So again, I very much appreciate the introduction. There are several things I'm going to focus on. In some sense, the prompting for this thing is this book that's just come out called The Dust of Kandahar, A Diplomat Among Warriors in Afghanistan. And I'm going to focus on that. I think some of this is quite personal and maybe more personal than you expected to get, but I'll talk about that. In the longer range, though, and you know, half the time will be for questions. I certainly will appreciate any questions that people have. I'll be happy even to stay afterwards. I know this will be over and done within an hour. But you know, my career trajectory, if you will, I did join the Foreign Service in 1984 and have served in different places, I guess 10 countries in 32 years. Just retired a few weeks ago. I'm actually teaching a class at my hometown university, Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. But welcome to ask any of the questions of anything as I get onto it. I think that like any Foreign Service career, it's been diverse places, but there is kind of a theme of Central and South Asia and those connections. Mongolia, we just asked a few minutes ago which country made the strongest impression on us, and we actually picked Mongolia, which is a hugely interesting place for all kinds of reasons. Of course, a small landlocked country, like Afghanistan, landlocked, like Afghanistan, and a tough place as far as neighbors are concerned. You know, in the case of Mongolia, of course, it's Russia to the north, China to the south. In the case of Afghanistan, the neighbors it's had to contend with is certainly Iran, Soviet Union, Russian Empire, India, sometimes Indian, sometimes British Empire, but they've kind of been squeezed by their neighbors as well, and so there's similarities there. I was telling Khalid before I came that actually Afghanistan was Jingis Khan's favorite country, which may be a dubious kind of distinction when you think about it. And actually, what is true, there's a book that just came out on Jingis Khan by Jack Weatherford, and he brings this point is actually, and I don't know if even Khalid would know this, but Jingis Khan's favorite grandson was killed at Bamiyan. And I think he had a pretty positive relationship with Afghanistan, but when his favorite grandson was killed, who know the history, you know that when the Mongols came through, they left an impact, and some of it was a destruction as well. But it's an interesting connection for all kinds of reasons. I guess just to bring it up to date, and this may come as a surprise to Khalid as well, is that when I was ambassador in Mongolia, I spoke at it was a 2-week training course for Afghan diplomats, which the Mongolian Foreign Ministry had sponsored. Mongolia only has 3 million people. Afghanistan has 30 million people. Mongolia physically is actually much bigger in terms of the land area. But I think it was interesting. I think some of the Afghans were surprised at what Mongolia had done as a country, and what its relatively small but frankly very effective foreign service had been able to do as well, kind of get a sense about how a country which is indeed surrounded by powerful neighbors, can still have a global impact. So it's kind of interesting. And you know, further on, I may you know, welcome questions on Mongolia as well. The books I've written have been about countries that have left a big imprint on me, and one was on, or two were on Pakistan, one was on Afghanistan that I'll mostly talk about, and indeed one was on Mongolia as well. In terms of the introductions here, though, because this is the Clinton Center, I couldn't help but say a couple things about encounters with the Clinton family over the years. And this is partly in the context of I don't know if anybody's interested in the Foreign Service, but it'll give you an insight into the kinds of things that Foreign Service officers do. And so the first one is my encounter with Bill Clinton was actually in Jordan. The King Hussein passed away in 1999. And you know the history. It was he had cancer. He knew what was coming. He cared about his kingdom, about his family. He changed the line of succession so actually his son, rather than his brother, would become. And his son was only in his early 20s, now King Abdullah. So he changed the line of succession, and of course the cancer took this relentless toll. He died in I believe it was February 1999, and there were 4 presidents that came to that funeral. The current president would have been Bill Clinton. And then the former presidents included Carter, included Ford, included the first Bush. And what embassies do, and of course, by the way, it was a tribute to King Hussein that people from all over the world came. I remember Tony Blair was there, Havel, the head of Czech Republic, was there. The chief rabbi of Israel and the head of Al-Azhar University. And I think it was a tribute indeed to the kind of reach. I don't think there was any world leader that could have brought so many people there. And this was only with a few days of advance notice. But of course, in the embassy, we had to take care of our visitors, and each president had an officer assigned to them. My assignment was somewhat different, though. It was what's called the control officer at the gravesite. So obviously this was the Jordanians' event, and they were the ones that did everything. But I was the Foreign Service person that got the card to be there at the gravesite, so that when our presidents came, if there were any issues, I could, phone up and try to handle them or whatever. So a huge privilege, actually, to be there, but also to see the 4 presidents, including Bill Clinton, there. The second one, Chelsea Clinton. She also came to Jordan. She was a student at the time at Stanford University. And once again, I'm saying this for those of you that join the Foreign Service, one of the things you do is you become the control officer for your senior visitors. And in the case of Chelsea Clinton, we had a great trip down to the Dead Sea, and we finished up at what's called the Citadel. Has anybody here been to Amman, Jordan? It's a wonderful, in the center of town, an old Roman ruin. Pierre Bacay, who since passed away, was the archaeologist with the American Center for Oriental Research. It was actually an aid project that we were funding, and so I finished off her day. It was just her day in Amman. Her mother, Hillary, was also visiting. And then the last story I can't help myself is when I left Mongolia for the last time in 2012, we had a visit by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, which of course is a huge honor for all kinds of reasons. And I've told people to, as ambassador, the guest comes off the plane, you're the first person to meet them, and the most memorable lines I'll ever speak in my life, Madam Secretary, welcome to Mongolia. So that was a fun thing. And then we went into town, and the President Albrecht, and down in the government house, they have you know what a yurt is? It's that round felt thing that you see in Mongolia. They call it a ger, actually. But they have a ceremonial ger in the government house in Ulaanbaatar, and you walk in, and they have the furs on the wall and the pictures of Jingis Khan and the great Mongols of history, and of course you're served fermented mare's milk. I think I was about the only one there that enjoyed the fermented mare's milk, but that was part of the ceremony as well. But when President Albrecht was escorting the group in, he used the words, Madam Secretary, welcome to our Oval Office. Which I thought, given the round nature of the yurt, so that was a good line. In any case, it's a huge honor to be here. It's something I really didn't expect. My Foreign Service career actually kept me out of the States for 30 years. We, of course, connected when I served in Pakistan. Well, when I served in Pakistan, the family lived here. We had our leaves, and we made a conscious effort to keep in touch that way. But unusually in a Foreign Service career, I never had a Washington assignment. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I'm not sure. Maybe there are things I missed out on, but it just, I was never in Washington. So when we're talking about, the Dust of Kandahar, and we have opportunities to speak about it, and Fiona, my wife's here, who's shared this Foreign Service with me, when we go to these places, we kind of call this our Reconnect with America after 30 years away trip. And we've enjoyed it immensely. We were down in Austin before, and the anchor for my week is teaching at Mercer University, but on the long weekends, if it's within driving distance, I try to talk about the Dust of Kandahar, which I will speak about. This book, I don't know if anybody's read it or not, but in some sense it kind of wrote itself. The title itself, the Dust of Kandahar, was written first. It was probably that first week I came to Kandahar and was walking around the Kandahar airfield. And those of you, has anybody been to Afghanistan besides Khalid? Okay, great. From Afghanistan, or many years? Wow, okay. Yeah, no, very different. I actually have a picture. As Khalid was mentioned, I was born and raised in Pakistan. A year after I was born, my parents went to Kabul when it was a dirt road. And it was a remarkable thing in many ways. I don't remember that particular trip, but I do have a picture of me at Pagman being held by my mother at 1 year old. And in the 60s, we visited quite often, not quite often, but from time to time. And then when I graduated from school in Islamabad in 1975 with 2 classmates, I went by bus and train, obviously not train in Afghanistan, by bus in that country because there was no trains, but basically not even one bus. It was just going from town to town, spend the night at a tea shop, continue on. I was 18 years old. We went Peshawar, Kabul, Ghazni, Kandahar, Herat, on into Mashhad, on into Tehran. And it was a great sort of coming-of-age visit, but like you implied, a hugely different Afghanistan at that time. Did you spend quite some time in Afghanistan? Okay, now I got the connection. I'm glad that you can be here. Thanks so much. You probably could do some good talks on Afghanistan as well. You probably do that. But mine was sort of, I had spent those years. I do not speak Farsi or Dari or Pashto. I can understand some conversations simply because of the words. Certain of the more formal words are also find their way into Urdu. But all my work was through a translator. Most of my career has been USAID in a development context. Obviously, to be an ambassador was at the State Department on a secondment, if you will. My assignment in Afghanistan was also not an aid assignment. It was a State Department assignment. I was what's called the senior civilian representative for southern Afghanistan. If we had had a consulate, maybe I would have been the CG, but basically it was an important region. Kandahar, of course, in some sense might be called the Pashto capital. Certainly a lot of the cultures come from there. Mullah Omar came from the region. The Durrani clan, the kings of Afghanistan for many years, came from Kandahar. President Karzai's family also, the Popelzais, came from the south as well. So it was an important region, and I was the senior civilian representative for the U.S. In that place. In this book, as you'll see, basically it rotates. I started my conversations talking about 3 worlds, but actually the book is about 4 different worlds. The first world is the military world, which was new to me. I don't come from a military background, but it was probably the most violent place was in the southern part of Afghanistan. And a couple things to emphasize about this is simply that it was not just a U.S. military effort. I think if you go to Kabul, the flags, there's 60 or 70 flags, 60 or 70 countries. In the case of the South, the U.S. obviously was heavily involved. My area did not include Helmand, where starkly the British had been quite involved. Before the Americans were involved in Kandahar, the Canadians were a big impact there. And also, my area covered 4 provinces, including Uruzgan, Dayakundi, Zabul, and Kandahar. For Australia, if you talk to Australians, their view of Afghanistan is Uruzgan, which they were there in a big way and made a lot of sacrifices there. And that I was covered there. That was part of my coverage. So I was up in Uruzgan and interacted with the Australians. The Romanians were also there in a big way. If you go to the Romanian chapel, what happens? They built. I think they probably took. If their deployment has ended, they may have taken it with them. But over the years, when the Romanian soldiers came, they would put an icon in the chapel, and it was a very touching kind of place. I spent an Easter service there, I guess it was 4 years ago, and there were 40 pictures of Romanian soldiers who had paid the supreme sacrifice, mostly in the south. They had tried to keep the road open, between Kandahar and Kabul. And then multiple, the Singapore flag was there, the Albanian flag was there. There were many people. So it was much more perhaps of an international effort. The Jordanians were there. I had some fascinating encounters with the Jordanians, including being served mansaf. The Jordanian chaplains were there from the Hashemite kingdom. They were interacting with the mullahs there in a very interesting way because, of course, their family, the Hashemites, trace their ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad. So the Emirates were there. I mean, there was such an international group that was there that wanted, Afghanistan to succeed. And so, part of my world was interacting with that military group. Like I said, it included the Jordanians, a very memorable meeting, and having served in Jordan to be served the mansaf by the Jordanian military and this was actually in Zabul, was kind of cool, and it was one of those memories. Because of the war going on, in some sense, I got an up close and personal view of to see it. I was in the headquarters, if you will, and so the 4 generals there were General Abrams, son of the general after whom the Abrams tank is named. There was General White. There was General Hughes, and there was also General Brewer from Australia. And again, the international aspect was important. He was part of that command, and I was there as well. I think the thing I'll do as I look at the clock here is just say very quickly, the most touching part of that encounter, if you will, with the military was the realization of the sacrifices involved. And it truly was the sacrifices. And again, not just the Americans. I remember the Slovak soldier that was killed at Kandahar, and actually the Slovak prime minister came out. I think this was their first casualty in Afghanistan, a smaller contingent, but they were there. But certainly the Americans that I was there, and there were three ways in which you saw that. I mean, one of them was simply the Purple Heart ceremonies, which the Kandahar Trauma Center was there, and a lot of the casualties were IEDs. I might also add that it was an international effort, but Afghanistan was at the front and center of it. During the time that I was there, 80% of the casualties were Afghan casualties. And so, again, I don't know if people have different impressions about what's happening, but certainly the Afghans, were paying the cost of war. But in the case of the ISAF, the casualties would come into the trauma center, and again, because of the way war is conducted, they would come in very quickly, and by helicopter, and in many cases, people would survive that would not have survived in earlier wars, but would survive with limbs missing and everything else like that. And to have, in a pretty much, I want to say, weekly basis, Purple Heart ceremonies, and to attend them and honor the soldier. In some ways, good news stories if they were to survive, but very harsh stories too about people's lives who've been totally changed. And so that was part of my job as the civilian representative. There was also the ramp ceremonies. I don't know if you know what a ramp ceremony is, but it's the final journey, if you will, for the soldier that remains going back to the States or Australia or the UK or Slovakia or wherever it may be, and very touching events, and sometimes at 2 a.m. in the morning, and basically hundreds of people would turn out to honor what was happening. Because of our emphasis on civilians, civilian control of the military, that last group that was lined up would be before the remains were taken into the airplane. I was placed there at the very last person, and then there'd be General Abrams, and then the other generals and the officers, and then hundreds of men that would pay their last respects. The third ID, and most of these were indeed the 3rd Infantry Division. They all have a song. For the third ID, it was Amazing Grace, and sometimes it would be played on the bagpipes, and sometimes in a tape recorder. And the chaplain would read a few remarks, and again, intensely moving, and a reminder very, very frequently about the cost of war. And then, finally, the last service, if you will, was the memorial service on the territory of where the unit was. And some of these were very far-flung places in Afghanistan. And Mosamgar, I don't know if that will ring any bells or whatever, but some of these places were very isolated. And a couple of weeks after the death of a soldier, or sometimes more than one, they would gather, and this is the small group in the unit that knew the person very well, and it would be the classic in the U.S. military tradition, and other traditions as well, the boots, the rifle, the helmet, and they would pay tribute. The commander, which was sometimes a sergeant, sometimes a lieutenant, would pay tribute, and these remarks would be given to the family, and then those of us that were observing what would happen would go up, and we would hold the dog tag and be reflective about it. Some soldiers would go up and rip off their insignia and put it down. Some would leave a note or a medal behind or something like this, and these would be gathered up and given to the families. And then the final very touching ending was what they call the roll call, which is where they go in alphabetical order, the names of the people in the platoon, and they would do alphabetically, Brown, James Brown, present, Edwards, Joseph Edwards, present, and then they would get to the name of the person, McMillan, no answer, Tom McMillan, no answer, Tom James McMillan, and then someone from one of the fellow soldiers would say, "He's not here, sir, he's left us." And then they would have the taps as the day is done, as we call it. And, this was a part of my life, and I'm dwelling on it quite a bit because I think people should know the sacrifices that come with war, and this was part of what one experienced, and it was part of that year, and a very moving part of it. The second part, which I'll talk about the least of all, is the civilian part. This is the world I was more familiar with. Like I said, if we'd been a consulate, I guess I would have been the consular officer. We did things what consuls do everywhere. We, reported on conversations we had. We tried to get a sense for what was happening. And in my case, one of the dominant themes was the elections the next year, and how people felt about those. There was 3 consulates in Kandahar, as it happens. One of them was the Iranian consulate. One was the Indian consulate. One was the Pakistani consulate. 3 countries that have a vital interest in Afghanistan. When I talk to the Afghans, I often used to say, the next chapter of Afghanistan's written most of its chapters of its history, and I said, it's for yours to write. Other people have contributed, but it's your chapter, the next chapter. And one of the Afghan tribal leaders looked at me ruefully and said, no, if you guys aren't writing the chapter, it's going to be the Pakistanis or the Iranians that are going to write it. And so, it was this sort of tough position about a smaller country with powerful neighbors that kind of came out. But it was interesting. I did not meet, obviously, for diplomatic reasons with our Iranian counterparts, but I did go to the Indian Consulate and celebrate their National Day, and I had multiple meetings with the Pakistan consular officers, and to get their perspective. That's what embassies do. That's what you do. You compare notes and have conversations, and of course the UN representative was also there. So there was a small diplomatic corps. There was also civilians reporting to our ambassador in Kabul through me, who did development programs, who did political reporting, who did all kinds of things. And so my responsibility was for, when I arrived, 140 people at 14 locations, and of course I visited them all, I interacted with them. It was on a downturn. By the time I left, there were 40 civilians in one location. It was during that time of transition, but that was obviously part of my life, part of my responsibility. The third and most interesting part, of course, were with the Afghans, and in some sense the reason why I came. Dozens and dozens of conversations. Interestingly enough, Afghans that I met, they wanted to talk. They wanted to talk with no matter where they came from. There was a whole spectrum of views. Some of them feared the Taliban. Some of them were very sympathetic to the Taliban. Some of them certainly wanted the Taliban to prevail. But it ran the whole spectrum. And so amazing conversations, whether with tribal leaders, government officials, with mullahs, religious leadership, the business community, basically all kinds of people. One of the frequent people we talked to, for example, was Shah Wali Karzai, who was the half-brother of the then president, and just to get his perspective, how elections were playing out, what he thought. That's what embassies do, is to try to gauge what's happening in the country and let that inform decision-making. Another guy I met was the keeper of the cloak. I don't know if you guys know who the keeper of the cloak is, but it's the cloak of Muhammad that is kept there in a shrine. It's only been taken out on a few occasions, including when Mullah Omar waved it in front of the crowd, and actually Hamid Karzai also visited, and they took out the cloak for him. So that was another kind of conversation. Some of the business community, a lot more business activity than you might imagine in Kandahar, including construction and even factories. And of course, we were encouraging the export of fruits and nuts and melons from the south to other places. So a lot of conversations there. We did have a conversation with a number of the religious leaders as well, and one that has struck me, and I talk about it in some places. Certainly, everything I'm saying is in this book. Is a conversation in the Arghandab with 4 religious leaders, at least a couple of them whom were very, very sympathetic to the Taliban, but just to gauge what they thought. And when the week before I had this conversation, I had met with a government official whose 6-year-old son had been killed in a suicide attack, and it was, very touching for all kinds of reasons. Obviously, the 6-year-old son was the huge loss. It was the Afghan version of take your son to work day, and he happened to be with his dad that day. And so I asked the religious leaders in turn. It turned out the suicide bomber in this case was, I think he was an adolescent, 16-year-old, who had somehow been encouraged to come in and do this. And I asked the classic question, on Judgment Day, what does a 16-year-old kid say about what his purpose on Earth was? And people gave different explanations, although usually it was the religious would say, that's not right, that's not Islam, that's not the way it should be, we're different than that. This one guy, though, who he basically said, that's hard, it's too bad it happens all too often in my country, but in my country there's no justice and there won't be peace without justice. And you can interpret that in many ways. As a student, many of your students here, I heard I went in Chicago to, as part of my education, to hear someone from the IRA speak, or not the IRA, but sympathetic to them, and that was their favorite line: "No peace without justice." And you can rationalize and justify all kinds of things. In my book, there are certain things you cross, including convincing 16-year-olds to blow themselves up to kill 6-year-old kids. But that was the line that you will hear all over the world: no peace without justice. And I don't have the answer, but it's a challenge that one might make. And I will say that when we left, this mullah embraced me, and he said, thank you for hearing me. I am a nobody, I have no voice, but you tell your people, I guess the people being the embassy, that there will be no peace in Afghanistan without justice. So, again, we can talk about all this stuff, and that was sort of, part of it, but it was a very interesting, and again, dozens, my life in Kabul and my life in Afghanistan was not always inside the wire, as they said. I traveled extensively and had some, what I consider some remarkable conversations that are chronicled here. So those were the three worlds, if you will. Was the world of the soldiers, which was new to me, the world of the civilians, international as well, that was more familiar to me, and then the world of the Afghans, which in some sense was the main intent and purpose of that of the time being there. But of course, the third or the fourth world was my interior life, about how I was processing this thing that I never thought I'd be in, and so that's the fourth part about this Dust of Kandahar, a diplomat among warriors, is every day transversing these different worlds, but also having the world inside my head about what I was trying to make sense of what I saw around me. And I guess the way that I conclude, I think it's okay to say this, and I don't want to say it so often that I sort of changes the memory, if you will. But 2/3 of the way through this assignment, I myself was subjected to a two ID attack. As a civilian, you get 3 leaves during your time during your year. My second leave was to meet my wife, who was stayed in Mongolia, and I had just gotten back on Thursday. On Friday, before I had left, I had said, if we take this trip to visit the school, I will plan to go. And so that was the plan. That was Kabul was doing some stuff, and we had agreed that we would do this trip. And so I came back on the Thursday afternoon. On the Friday, we went over the details of the trip. Of course, we have military escorts. And on Saturday, we went up to Zabul. And there were 5 of us that met on the tarmac before taking our helicopter up. There was myself, there was Nassimi, my translator, there was Ann Schmiedinghoff, a fellow Foreign Service officer, there was Abbas, an Afghan American from the Public Affairs Office in Kabul, and there was Kelly, my colleague in Kandahar, who was in charge of our own public affairs effort as well. She was actually ex-military, but had done her service for 4 years. She'd been in the public affairs side of the military, and then she took the civilian position as well. So the 5 of us went up. There was a 6th person that might have gone, but at the last minute we said, no, we're big enough, we don't need anybody else. And I was the only one to come back. And, I'll describe in a minute, being up there for those few hours. But after it was all over, the same helicopter, the crew chief, we went up to Zabul. He jumped out of the helicopter. He looked at his flight manifest, and I was sitting alone. And he said, "Is that it? Are you the only one?" And the other thing I remember about that conversation on the tarmac, I had met Ann for the first time. Obviously, I was especially close to my translator, Nassimi. He was an Afghan American. He was already an American citizen. His family was in New Jersey. Like many Afghans, he was supporting multiple people, nephews. He was unmarried himself, but he was supporting nephews and nieces in New Zealand and New Jersey and other places as well. And we did talk, ironically enough, we talked about migration and the sort of places where his family had been scattered all over the world. And I just made the offhand comment that migration is a tough thing to do, and more often you do it for your kids. Because it's hard for an adult to do it, and that was, just the conversation, which of course in retrospect you reflect on. But we flew up there, we had our briefing, we walked out, and the details are in there, but basically there was a small explosion first, and I threw myself into a nearby shallow ditch. And did think this was, and there was a second explosion too, by the way. The second one was a vehicle, the small ID was probably only about 5 pounds, but the big explosion was 50 pounds on each door, and the idea was to plow into the relief workers as they were helping. I think he was a little bit too early. This particular car, I knew it because when I walked out, the car was right in front of me, literally right there, and the soldiers were saying, no, you can't park here. And why he didn't detonate when I was walking out, I'll never know. But, there was that first explosion. My world was that ditch. And I thought I was going to die. And this was the last minutes of my life. If there's any reassurance to know, at least my reaction, and maybe it's because of my age, was that I had lived a good life. And it was one of acceptance and peace. It was not one of fear and terror. So if I derive anything from that, that was what was there. But then, of course, the aftermath of something like that is everything horrific that you can imagine. It's described there. I won't go into it. But the first aid station, some people die immediately on the scene. And again, you can imagine the scene which Afghanistan experiences far too often. This kind of thing. That stayed with me, and I guess on the sort of the finishing note is that I did go back, the loneliest flight I ever took, down to Kandahar. The next day, it was the ramp ceremony for my colleagues. Two of them, by the way, the five that went up with me, were critically in one case and seriously in another injured. But Nassimi was killed, and Ann was killed, and the three soldiers, Staff Sergeant Ward was from Tennessee and also lately from Florida. Sergeant Santos, his family originally came from the Philippines, and Corporal Santo, similar name, was from Puerto Rico, and they were killed as well. So there were 5 sets of remains that were going back. We had the ramp ceremony, except for this time I went into the plane. We went to Bagram, we went to Frankfurt, we went to Dover. In Bagram, just as an aside, the song they play there was Abide With Me. They'd repeat the ramp ceremony each time to honor. And then when you get into Dover, and you've maybe seen that in movies or on television screens when the flight comes in, what you don't know is that it's crowded airspace, but when an airplane, a military aircraft carrying the remains comes in, the pilot signals and says, flight such and such a stuff, carrying American heroes, and the flight controller in Baltimore responds immediately, such and such a flight cleared for landing, American heroes coming home. And it's intensely moving to hear that, to be honest. And then, of course, you do go to Dover, and the family's there. So I had insisted that I come back. I met people there, went into Washington briefly, then 2 days later came back to Kandahar and completed my assignment. And again, this is the last thing to say before turning over for questions, but this book is meant to honor and remember the sacrifices made, and I hope it does that. I think certainly even you won't know where I stand politically on anything from this book. You won't know a policy thing about how things could be better, or what we did wrong, or what the big mistakes were, or what we got right, or whatever, or a defense of what we did. It's nothing like that. It's simply a human story about what has become our country's longest war. And it brings, I think, some aspects of that war, including the international aspect, including the Afghan aspect, that may not necessarily be all that common knowledge, and yet was part of the year that I spent there. So I will leave it at that. I don't know if this is what you expected. I will be happy to talk about any aspect of my career. I could talk all night about Mongolia. I could talk a lot about Pakistan. I have also served in places like Cambodia and Yemen and Jordan and India. But anything is sort of fair territory. I'd love to engage, love to answer questions, and so thank you. Thanks. Yes.
All right, we have time for questions. Judge Brown, hold on, wait for the microphone, please.
There's one.
Good. Thank you, sir. I enjoyed the talk. I want to go apart from what you basically talked about, and that is the policy by the United States towards Afghanistan. And you were in the Foreign Service for 30 years. You worked, I guess, to some extent under 4 presidents at least. What do you think the most effective policy by the United States towards Afghanistan has been, and why?
The most effective?
Most effective.
Yeah. There's lots of things that one could say, and again, I'm not going to pretend I know more than I know. I think you will recall, and it's been interesting talking to people because people have different perceptions. I would draw an important distinction between Iraq and Afghanistan. If I ask some people today which war started first, Iraq or Afghanistan, a lot of people wouldn't know, to be honest. Afghanistan did start, of course, first, 2 years before Iraq. And I think at that time, of course, it was after 9/11, it was unquestionable that Osama bin Laden sought refuge, and that Mullah Omar would not return him or subject him to anything like what one might say would be justice after a deed like that. And so there was a lot of support in the beginning. My interpretation, and I'm no longer officially serving, so I can kind of say what I want to, but my interpretation is that in the first couple of years, it went better than people would have imagined. And in some sense, one's eye went off the target. And of course, then that's when Iraq happened. And then Afghanistan really did get to, it's perceived as less important. When Obama ran for president, of course, I don't know if he used these phrases, but it was referring to Afghanistan as the good war, that there was a reason why we were there, and that we could make a difference. And so, part of that administration was the surge. I was on the tail end of that, about when there were, the largest part of our presence. Now we have a small presence. If you were to ask me, I think that that's reasonable. Again, it's the Afghan chapter to write, it's the Afghan story to write, and they're doing that. We don't know how that story is going to end, but there are plenty of Afghans that want a different kind of Afghanistan, and I think that we should be supportive of that. I've sometimes used the expression, and I think I referred to it once in this book too, is the notion that we feel we have to be either all in or all out. And a case can be made for that. People say, well, they're half-hearted, what's the point? Let's be all in. I think in situations like Afghanistan, all in isn't necessarily what's required. But I think all out is a mistake too. If you recall, in the 90s, we were all out. And that led to Osama bin Laden and everything that followed. I think that you have to have local partners that you can trust. You have to have local partners that share your vision to some extent, that you work with. And if you don't have that, you don't have a viable place to be. But if you do have that, I think there's something to be said for staying the course. Obviously, we're not fighting wars, but we stayed in Korea for a long time after that war. So I think the longevity of that is not, that shouldn't inform the conversation, we just got to get out, because I think getting out completely is a big mistake. But again, I don't think it wouldn't be right to be there fighting that war for other people, if you will. But again, just to recall, in the South, the Afghans were taking the casualty. We were in a training role. I think that's an appropriate one as well. There's a lot more that I could be said about it, but I think I'll just leave that with that sort of thought that it's not always either or. And I guess my concern with how we engage with the rest of the world is either or, isolation or fully engaged. Maybe there's something in between that's a kind of a balance. And I think that the challenge in international affairs is to get that balance right. I personally don't always get it right. Our country doesn't always get it right. But I think we should engage with the world. If we don't engage with the world will certainly engage with us.
Yep. Yes, sir. We got a question right back there.
Yes, I'm Skip Ward. I served in USIA before that dissolved. How would you draw a comparison between diplomatic issues in, say, Mongolia with diplomatic issues you faced, and you can pick country why?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm interested in all those countries where you've served in as well. Mongolia was intriguing for a lot of reasons, including you actually did have issues that mattered because that full range of how you engage diplomatically, politically, economic way, development, and everything else, they were all at play in a relatively small stage, in a stage that was kind of welcomed what they call third country engagement. Their first and second neighbors, if you will, were Russia and China. What they wanted was to have that sense of balance, but also that window on the rest of the world. So whether you were Canada or Australia or Europe, Japan, Korea, they wanted that kind of engagement. And so it was a very positive one in that kind of sense. Obviously, in recent years, the situation in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and even South Sudan and stuff like that have changed the nature of our foreign service that we experienced. We raised a family with 3 kids, thought it was wonderful. It's more of a challenge now because you will get some of these separated assignments, although there's still plenty of countries where you have more of that normal, kind of engagement. And I think that's the way it should be. Not that there's not tough issues, even in a place like Mongolia. There's, Mongolia, again, the neighborhood's tough for them in terms of they've got a history, but they have to walk that diplomatic tightrope and maintain that balance. But I guess the good thing about Mongolia is it is mostly a diplomatic engagement with the commercial and the cultural as part of it as well, but it's not that security engagement, which, and lately it hasn't even been a development one because they've got the economic resources that they can, shape the future of their country. So that's kind of, I don't know what the highlight of your career was, but maybe not just the uniqueness of being in Mongolia at that place and time, but the fact that you could be productive in a kind of exchange like that is what made that country so special to us. Because I think you're exactly right that, and again, I don't know which countries you served in where that, nice place was reached, where you had that positive thing. But it's a great place to be. You have to hope that situations like Afghanistan are the exception. I did, and I don't know if this is what people expected, but I did talk about it. I mean, partly because of this book, but I truly want people to know the kinds of stuff that Foreign Service officers do, and we do the whole range. And I'm appreciative that my career included the whole range. I couldn't have survived; it was all Afghanistan. At the same time, it's called the Foreign Service. This is the Clinton School of Public Service. That word service means something to me. And, it hasn't been asked here yet, but some people say, was it worth it? What were you there? What do you think now? I joined the Foreign Service, and so that was a voluntary thing. I wasn't forced to go there, but I truly, believe in playing out that service even in tough places like Afghanistan, which is what I tried to do.
Yes, sir. We got a question right here, and here comes the microphone. What did you say? Yeah.
Our son is a Foreign Service officer in Kabul now.
Oh, wow, okay.
And I'm wondering what you think the attitude might be or how it might affect them that there's just silence at the head of the State Department right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer these things because I'm no longer serving a Foreign Service officer. In Baghdad, too. Well, no, he's really experienced it. Just as an aside, obviously very much appreciate his service. Fiona's here as well and was with me throughout, but we had two separated assignments. One was Pakistan after the earthquake, and the remarkable story that probably here people don't know so much about, but it was in a place where the relationship has had some real problematic aspects. The earthquake reconstruction was a positive aspect of that relationship, and I think that State Department, USAID we're part of that as well. Boy, there's so many things here. By the way, there are no civilians with the State Department in Kandahar right now. I think everybody pretty much is in Kabul. When I was there, we were still engaging in a broader way of the country, and I purposefully, made the request to be outside Kabul. But there's real challenges, but they're beating Afghans. I mean, more Afghans coming in, but they're still having a chance to sort of observe. I don't know what his specialty is. I think people that serve there do sense the interest or lack of interest in what they're doing, and they do need that encouragement. I think this extends to our soldiers as well. I think one of the things when you read about PTSD and stuff like that is that, and I think they try to do it because sometimes it almost seems forced. You come back and they say, thank you for your service, and it almost becomes rote because people realize that people do leave those situations and they do walk away thinking nobody recognizes my country. What do they think of what I was doing there? So I think that affirmation, and of course in an institution, that affirmation from the very top is hugely important. I think that includes visits. I guess since even I'm retired, I'm not going to go to some places, but I think that the visit by your senior person to the country where you're serving, he or she cannot go everywhere in the world, but for them to go where people are doing tough service, where people are putting their lives in danger in service to their country, I think regardless of one's politics, one has to recognize that, and at a personal level, I think it's tough. I think the transition is hard, and I think that what part of this is public engagement. Again, that public affirmation that what our Foreign Service does matters. The fact that our Foreign Service officers do put themselves on the line. I think it's, again, I had a window on the military world that I was unfamiliar with. I might just say as an aside that one of my sons spent 4 years in the military and the other one is just enlisted. He's in boot camp as we speak. And so, they made their choices, but I think that, as a family, one recognizes service both in uniform and out uniform. And
we were a military family. Served in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Our son has been in Iraq and also Afghanistan now for 9 months.
Yeah.
We find that most of the public has very little understanding of the Foreign Service and where they are, what they do, and who they do it for.
Of course, we certainly understand it. We've been everywhere they've been, Mexico City,
Right.
Warsaw, and such as that. So
Well, that comment, I think, even brings it closer to home in the fact that you had your service in Vietnam. And ironically, I think people in the military recognize that. This book, as modest as this audience might be, but A Diplomat Among Warriors in Afghanistan, that is a purposeful title, and it is purposeful to acknowledge that civilian service, which is part of it. And again, in other more normal circumstances, there's the military attaché office. They're reaching out, if you will, to in this case, the Mongolian military, as you mentioned. And by the way, the Mongolian flag was one of those that flew in Afghanistan. They were providing the security at Kabul airport. And when I was ambassador, I went down and visited them because I really wanted to be able to say to the Mongolian public that I had been there and I had seen their soldiers in action. But again, you having served, and now your son serving in both Iraq and Afghanistan, you put your finger on, frankly, the intent of part of this book is, at least in some modest way, to get people to recognize more that service out of uniform is also important and even vital.
Got a question right here.
Hi there, my name is Fiona O'Leary Sloan, and I'm a first-year student at the Clinton School. And I'm wondering if you can speak, especially in light of the war in Afghanistan initially being framed in terms of winning hearts and minds and rebuilding and all of that, to the relationship on the ground that you saw between U.S. government aid organizations like USAID, the State Department, and the military, and how they were separate and worked together.
Yeah, no, this one could obviously talk for a long time as well. Afghanistan is a very tough place to work. There's some people in this room that have background experience in Afghans and frankly work with Afghans in a way that nobody in the embassy can. Although, of course, USAID, does have partners, including Afghan partners, that support that development endeavor that you were talking about. Maybe use Kandahar as an example. Mine was not an aid job, but it covered the whole gamut of the embassy, but certainly the aid part of that was important. And we had partners, international partners, Afghan partners that receiving USAID funding in this case, U.S. taxpayers funding, and we're working in all the areas that you've alluded to, education, health, other things. Khaled and I were talking about before about the perception that nothing's happened. Actually, in about 10 years, the average life expectancy in Afghanistan has gone from 40-something to 60-something. And the reason that's happened is, frankly, because of a health system that means a lot fewer babies die, and that's a product of some of the work in the health by the donor agencies, by the NGOs, by others. Same thing in education. I would often ask, I think both Zabul and Erzincan had about 300,000 people, and I would ask how many girls graduated from high school last year, and I'd get something 7, 12, or whatever. But then I would ask a couple of years from now, and it would be hundreds or sometimes thousands. You do the math. You can't graduate unless you've been to the 9 previous grades. And so that cohort of first grade girls that were able to go to school, now 10, 12 years later, we're going to do something different. And so I think that aspect is one of the untold stories. The military is short-term in nature. Diplomacy, quite frankly, is often short-term in nature. I think that the development side, you do take a long perspective, sometimes maybe not with as much effect as you might want. But I think in Afghanistan, there was development work by the military. There's no question that they go into a village, they ask what the first priority is, and if it's a well or if it's an irrigation embankment, they'll try to provide it. The problem with that, as an development person sees it, is that just building the structure isn't enough. You have to have the systems in place to keep it going, or the next flood it goes apart. What happens? I think, if anything, that's the lessons that I've sort of learned. And again, Colin, I don't want to misconstrue this, but I think that even talking to some Afghans in the conversations that I had, they would imagine a health facility, a hospital, a factory. I mean, that's the physical manifestation of the end of some huge long process that requires all kinds of things, and the process to get there is the long slog and the hard slog. And I think that as development players, I think we were able to remind the military, if you will, that it's not enough to build a structure. You got to see who's going to maintain it. Are they trained to do it? What happens after that? Another one that was in the book here. There's a picture of it. I don't know if this picture's in here or not, but the Kajaki Dam. The frustrations of getting that third turbine, which would make such a difference. That turbine now is in place, by the way, and it's in place even after a lot of the soldiers have left and stuff like that. It's now 3 turbines rather than 2. That was the work of a lot of people in a lot of places, and eventually it happened. Some of the stuff doesn't happen as quick as you want. I could write sort of longer things. I've talked to some people, including some people on this trip who have also served in Afghanistan, and you get mixed views about that civil-military relationship. I thought it was in a reasonably okay place during, the time there, which isn't to say there weren't huge challenges. You put your finger on a huge issue that needs to be a longer conversation.
I know there are more questions, and I hope you will answer them when you come and visit with the ambassador and talk to him about his book. This is a fascinating subject. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for coming to the Clinton School.
Thank you.